What's up everyone, I'm Aldrich and welcome back to my Tree of Savior guide series. Today I'm going to give you the basics of the Swordsman archetype. And I'm going to preface this by saying that PvP in Tree of Savior really doesn't interest me all that much. Because I think it's incredibly unbalanced and gimmicky as all hell. And I'm telling you this so that you know all the PvP information I give you is from other people, stuff I read on the forums. I have absolutely no experience with it and no interest in it whatsoever. In this guide I'm going to focus on the first two ranks of the Swordsman archetype, which form the basis of practically any build in the game. The first rank of Swordsman, in my opinion, is the most lackluster of any of the archetypes. The reason for this is that a lot of the abilities that you get are just not that great later on in the game. And so let's go over them. Gung Ho is probably the first ability you should actually invest points in. It is a self-buff stance that increases your physical attack, thus making your basic attack stronger. It also, however, decreases your defense. The next skill is Concentrate, and Concentrate is also a self-buff that increases your physical damage for a certain number of attacks. These two skills combined make your basic auto attacks relatively strong in the early game of Tree of Savior. So during about the first 80 to 120 levels. They're great because they are AoE, they do a lot of damage if you use these buffs, and they kill stuff relatively quickly without having to use a ton of SP. Now the problem with both of these abilities is that they really don't do very much for abilities. They only really buff your auto attack damage. And as such, the further you progress with your swordsman, the less useful these two abilities are going to be, because you're going to use more and more abilities the higher you level up, and less basic auto attacks. I would still pick up both of these abilities for the early game, because they are going to make it much easier for you to level. Next we have two attack skills. Thrust may seem good when you pick it up, but it is probably one of the worst abilities in the game, unless you go for Swordsman Circle 2. But we'll talk about that later. In most builds, Thrust is entirely useless and you should not put any points into it. It has no cooldown but barely does any more damage than an auto attack and really isn't worth it. Bash, however, has a component that makes it pretty powerful no matter what build you pursue. And that is, if you put 3 points into Bash, you gain access to an attribute that gives Bash a knockdown component. And so with the basic Bash ability, you will be able to knock down 3 monsters at a time. This makes Bash very valuable, and it makes it one of the only two abilities that you're actually going to use throughout your entire character's career. The other ability that you're going to use throughout your career is Pain Barrier. It is an incredibly boring buff that just prevents your character from being knocked back or knocked down. However, it has a pretty good duration and a rather short cooldown, and as such is just always going to be useful. So as you can see, you really don't gain all that much from Swordsman Circle 1. The higher you level, the more of your abilities are going to become useless, and in the end you're really just going to be stuck with Bash and Pain Barrier. So let's move on to rank 2, and I'm going to preface this by saying that if you want to do mostly PvE, and PvP is either not of any interest to you, or you're not planning on doing a lot of PvP, then I would, in every single case, recommend Peltasta Circle 1. Why is that? Well, to explain, let's look at the other choices first. So when you gain Swordsman Circle 2, suddenly Thrust actually becomes a sort of viable ability, because you unlock another attribute that causes Thrust to cause bleeding damage on stunned targets. The Swordsman archetype has a lot of abilities that cause stun, and as such, putting 1 point into Thrust just to have a bleeding ability isn't all that bad. But it isn't that amazing either, so don't get too excited about it. Beyond that, you can increase the damage of Gung Ho or Concentrate a little bit more, as well as Bash, but none of these are really all that useful. The two new abilities you gain on Swordsman Circle 2 are Restrain and Pommel Beat. Now if you are going for an entirely PvP focused character, then Swordsman Circle 2 can be an absolutely solid choice for you. The bleeding ability on Thrust, increasing the AoE count on Bash, and Restrain, a self-buff that causes you to have a higher chance of stunning with all your attacks, but reducing your hit points overall, is really quite useful and the only way that you can ever make Swordsman a viable class. Should you, however, be focused on PvE, then there is no point whatsoever in going Swordsman Circle 2, because the bleeding effect on Thrust is not powerful enough, neither is the AoE increase on Bash, and Restrain simply isn't good enough against monsters, because on higher levels, monsters do an insane amount of damage and you simply cannot rely on a chance to stun them. You either stun them or you don't stand in front of them, taking it in the face. The other choice at rank 2 is Highlander Circle 1. Highlander Circle 1 is probably one of the most specialized things that the game has to offer. The problem with Highlander is that it is such a low tier class that it is really difficult to get those abilities to actually do any decent damage. Highlander also was nerfed toward the end of the beta because it was way too strong before that, but sadly they overdid it a little bit and now Highlander is really just not that good. Wagon Wheel, for example, does pretty mediocre damage compared to the abilities you're going to get on the later ranks, from for example Barbarian or Cataphract. It has no multi-use, so you can only use one Wagon Wheel every 18 seconds, and it has a really long wind-up animation, which doesn't make it all that great for PvP. Overall, it's just a very mediocre ability, and you'll have a hard time finding a place for it on your hotbar the higher you go in level. Carter Stroke is similarly mediocre in that its damage is slightly higher than Wagon Wheel, but simply still no comparison to the higher tiered abilities. The worst thing about Carter Stroke is that it has a half-second casting time and a long wind-up animation behind that, which makes it practically unusable in PvP unless you're attacking a stunned target. But then why are you attacking a stunned target with such a weak sauce ability? Next we have Crown, and Crown at least has a little bit of utility, in that it debuffs the intelligence and spirit of the target it is used on. But the problem with Crown is that it is not a multi-use ability and has a really long cooldown of 30 seconds, and at the same time it does an incredibly tiny amount of damage. Crown with 5 points invested into it does less damage than Bash would with 5 points invested into it. And then finally we come to Crossguard, the only good ability in the Highlander Circle 1, in my opinion. It is a self buff that increases your defense quite significantly, allows you to block while carrying a two-handed weapon, and enemies whose attacks you block take extra piercing damage for a while. The only problem with this is that it is only usable with two-handed swords, and that makes it so incredibly specific. Now there are some builds that do use two-handed swords. Generally they go for Doppelsöldner on rank 6. Which means if you are going for a Doppelsöldner build, then you might think about doing Highlander. But then again, if you are a PvE player, I would still recommend Peltasta over Highlander. So in the very specific case that you're a PvP player who chooses Doppelsöldner, you can think about getting Highlander, but Swordsman Circle 2 might still be better. And then lastly we come to the Peltasta Circle 1, the class that I definitely recommend anyone who wants to do PvE in this game should get. The first ability is Umbo Blow. It is a melee attack that requires that you wear a shield, it has a good AoE rating, and it has access to very good attributes, including stun and knockdown. Rimblow is in sort of a funny place because it's really not that great of an ability, but it doesn't offer any utility, but in the end you still end up putting 4 points into it because there just isn't anything else to put them in. And next we have the reason to get the Peltasta class, Swashbuckling. Swashbuckling is an AoE taunt skill that has a huge range. I mean seriously, you can taunt things that you can't even see with this ability. It is incredibly good for pulling monsters close together, which for a class that has a lot of melee AoE is really good. And as soon as you're followed by a wizard or an archer who excel at AoE, they are going to thank you incredibly for being able to pull that many monsters together from that far away. But the best thing about Swashbuckling is that it has access to one of the most insane attributes in the game. We'll get to attributes later, but this specific attribute increases your maximum hit points by 25% while active. And with 5 points in Swashbuckling, you can have the ability up at all times. So while you are wearing your shield and you're doing a little bit of tanking, you have just a flat out 25% extra hit points. Anyone who has ever tanked in any MMORPG should immediately recognize how freaking powerful it is to have 25% extra hit points just flat out. And then the last ability for Peltasta Circle 1 is Guardian. It's a self-buffing stance, so it doesn't stack with Gung Ho, that boosts your defense but slightly nerfs your attack. It's basically the opposite of Gung Ho. I will say that this ability has awful scaling. When you pick it up with 1 point, it gives you 10 defense, and if you put 5 points in, it gives you 17 defense. And it initially reduces your attack by 10 or 14, and then on 5 points by 28. And so this really means that you just don't put in more than 1 point into Guardian, and then just grab the attribute that enhances it by another 50 defense. Simply to keep the damage reduction as low as possible. With 1 point invested, the duration is already longer than the cooldown, so there is no reason to put any more points into it. And because Ambo Blow is such a utility-heavy attack skill, Swashbuckling is so incredibly useful and powerful, and Guardian is such a great defensive stance, there really is no reason to go for anything other than Peltasta. Swordsman Circle 2 just doesn't add that much for PvE, so whether you're going for a tank build or not, picking up Peltasta is simply the best choice you can make. Because even if you don't want to be a tank all the time, Peltasta allows you to be a tank sometimes. The Circle 1 skills and attributes are pretty much all you need to tank practically any content in the game. Now, I'm not going to go into the rank 3 and onward classes because I think at that point you really have to start thinking about a specific build that you want to go for. In separate build videos I will go into detail on the other ranks and what exactly to take and how to use your attributes and skills to the best possible results. Now let's talk about leveling as a swordsman. As I already said in the beginning of this video, in the early game the swordsman absolutely excels as a grinding class. Wizard and Archer are just so much more reliant on their abilities because their auto attacks just aren't as good as the swordsman auto attacks. And this makes you the go-to class for early game grinding. Which at the same time means if you find a good grinding spot, you should make use of that spot for as long as you can. You can always go back and do the quests later, but the grinding spots at some point simply won't give you any more experience. And I am specifically talking about Tenet Garden. Tenet Garden is the single best grinding spot in the game currently, and it is important that you make use of it as much as possible. If you're solo, you can go there as early as 28 to level 30, and if you're in a group, you can go there as early as level 25. And you can easily level there until you hit 50. Now, one thing I will say is that swordsmen have a huge problem with hit points. Because you have a much bigger hit point pool as the other classes, and because you spend so much time in melee and have no self-heal, your hit point pool can become a real hindrance, because it takes forever to regenerate that hit point pool back up. So for a swordsman, it is always a good idea to look for a group, especially clerics. Actually, this is a general advice point. If you see other people around in Tenet Garden or any other grinding spot, try to invite them to a group, because group grinding is simply and flat out better in Tree of Savior. Now, the one thing that you might not like to hear, but you are going to have to hear, is that swordsmen are simply not as good at dealing damage as archers and wizards. In the early game you can outperform them because they still don't have their abilities and you have a better auto attack, but the further you go into the game and the higher you level up, they will start outperforming you immensely. Archers can start outperforming you as early as level 15, for wizards it usually takes a few more levels, but by level 100 to 150 you are just not going to do as much damage as archers and wizards. And that's something you'll have to accept. What you can provide to a group, however, that archers and wizards generally can't, is tanking. It is the one thing that swordsmen are really good at that the other classes just aren't. So when your group has no tank and kind of needs somebody to pull stuff together, you might want to pull out that shield and start swashbuckling the enemies so that the archer and wizard can do their job better. Now if you don't like this and you really don't want to tank, well, that's up to you. Do I like it that swordsman really isn't that great at dealing damage? No, but that's just the way it is, and you kind of have to accept it for now, until the developers feel that it's time to increase the damage of swordsman classes again. Now let's go quickly over the attributes, and the order in which I'm going to name them is the order in which you should get them, in my opinion. So for Swordsman Circle 1, the most important attribute is Bash Knockdown. It's just one rank, you need 3 points in Bash to acquire this attribute, and it turns Bash into a really useful ability for your entire career. Concentrate Enhance and Gung Ho Enhance are about the same thing. You should probably go for Gung Ho first if you want to put any points in that, because Gung Ho is going to become useless a lot quicker than Concentrate. Concentrate still remains sort of decent for quite a while longer than Gung Ho does. But at some point both of these abilities are going to be useless, so I personally would not invest all of the money into these 2 skills, because it's a little bit of a waste in the end. If you plan on doing any tanking, you should definitely also get Provoke, because having Provoke just makes it so much easier to actually catch the attention of monsters without having to constantly taunt them. And then lastly, of course, Plate Mastery Defense. Being a class that's good at tanking, you really want that extra defense provided by Plate Mastery. As lower priority attributes, I'm going to name Bash Enhance and Buff Limit Increase. Now the buff limit increase is pretty important, but it only becomes available at rank 5. So at rank 5, just grab it. It's 1 point, it's not a big deal. But Bash Enhance really does have some time. You don't have to immediately do that. It's just something you should get eventually because, as I said, you're going to use Bash a lot and then it might as well just do double damage, right? Should you choose to go for Swordsman Circle 2, the priority attributes become Restrain Slow, which, as the name says, introduces a slow component to the Restrain buff, Bash Splash, which adds extra AoE targets to the Bash ability, and then lastly Thrust Bleeding, and you should of course also put 1 point in Thrust so that you can make use of this attribute. If you do choose to go for Highlander, the first attribute you want to pick up is the two-handed swords. This allows you to use two-handed swords, which is kind of important because that's really the only thing the Highlander class does for you. You also want to immediately get Crossguard, Stagger Enhance, and Crossguard Enhance, because Crossguard is the one and only ability in Highlander that is really damn useful. And so buff it up as soon as you can to make the most use out of it. Two-handed sword specialization is the next, because again, you're a two-handed sword guy and you're gonna be your entire career if you picked up Highlander, so might as well put the points in there to increase your critical attack. And then lastly, Wagon Wheel Enhance, because it is an ability you're going to use, so might as well have it do double damage. If you're a PvE player and you're a smart cookie and you did go for Peltasta like I recommended, then the order in which you should get the attributes is first get Shield Guard. It's 1 point and it's a really good ability to block incoming attacks. Shield Mastery Block lets you block some attacks passively outside of shield guarding. And then Guardian Evasion and Swashbuckling maximum hit points round out your defensive abilities. Once you have these 4, you really are a force to be reckoned with when it comes to tanking. But the most important attribute is definitely Swashbuckling max hit points. It is so incredibly good. 25% extra hit points is just the bomb. After that, you want to go for Umber Blow Knockdown and Umber Blow Stun, as well as Guard Defense and Umber Blow Enhance last. Alright, and that is all I have to say about the first 2 ranks of Swordsman and what you should do with all of the attributes and skills. If you enjoyed this guide, please consider watching some of the other Tree of Savior guides I'm making, and maybe even look at my non-Tree of Savior content, because I make that too. But until then, I've been the Cloaking Donkey, and I'll see you in another video.